The Limits of Protection, an interview series. Calcutta Research Group, in collaboration with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, November 2019. Calcutta Research Group organized a research workshop and conference on global protection of migrants and refugees in collaboration with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung on 25th to 29th November 2019. This year's key theme was protection of refugees and migrants and its limits within the context of neoliberal globalization. A series of interviews were conducted with international experts on migration. In the discussion, the idea of protection was problematized from different angles. Labor migration in South Africa, an interview with Yordanos Estifanos, independent researcher, Addis Ababa. Estifanos discussed his research on labor migration in South Africa and the vagaries of the informal labor market. The interview was conducted by Sarah Nandi, a Fulbright scholar affiliated to the Sanskrit College and University, Calcutta.
Currently with Yordanos Seifu and we'll be discussing not only his presentations at the conference here today, but also a bit about his book, which came out in 2018 and is called Wayfarers, a travel journal. So my very first question, I'll keep it a little brief, but just to give us a little background on how did you get interested in this topic of transnational migration between Ethiopia and South Africa?
Okay, thank you for this opportunity. Back in Ethiopia, when I was studying at Addis Ababa University, I went to the demography department, which is population studies, and in that course, migration is treated as a foster child of demography, and not much attention was given to the issue of migration and urbanization. While both urbanization and migration were still a huge topic of interest, but there were no institutes or centers that focus on these issues or these events. So I thought I would continue my study on migration and international migration especially. So I started searching for opportunities elsewhere in the world which offered this course. And I found the EMIR program in Germany or in Europe. That is European Masters in Migration and Intercultural Relations. And I joined the program in 2013. The good thing about the EMIR program is its mobility and its flexibility in terms of methods and methodology. So they don't impose their own methodological approach or their own narratives in the migration studies. So I picked on migration studies in the program, and I originally wanted to study Ethiopian migrants or Ethiopian diaspora in the US and then or Ethiopian diaspora in Europe. But I found it difficult to start to do the research within the resources available, but more importantly, with the time that I was allocated to in that short period of time because of the background of the migrants in Europe and in the US. So I thought, because most of them are political exiles who do not provide information easily or who are not easy to get along with within given resource and time. So I tried it in Germany, I tried it in Norway, it didn't succeed. Then I started to look for Ethiopian migrants elsewhere in the world, and I found there is huge population in the Middle East and in South Africa. In the Middle East, again, it was difficult because access was not easy because most of the Ethiopian diaspora, the migrants in the Middle East are not accessible because they are involved in domestic service or are located in different corners of the countries in the Gulf. So I thought it would be easier to do my internship in South Africa and communicate with Ethiopians in Johannesburg and other townships in South Africa. And there are kind of enclave, there is kind of an enclave economy of Ethiopians in the center of Johannesburg, downtown Johannesburg. So I shifted my attention from Europe and the US to Ethiopian migrants in South Africa. And they are also more of an economic migrants than political migrants, which makes methodologically easier to socialize and build trust with Ethiopian migrants in South Africa. And they are also relatively recent migrants, which started with the fall of apartheid in South Africa and the fall of the military regime in Ethiopia. So they started migrating to South Africa starting from the mid 1990s. So a combination of these factors encouraged me to study the Ethiopian diaspora or the Ethiopian migrants in South Africa, and that's why I started this area of research.
So interesting and already lays out so many things that I want to return to and kind of touch on. So first, you mentioned that you were interested in looking at Ethiopian migrants in Europe and or maybe the US and this question of diaspora, but you kind of flipped that idea of diaspora a bit on its traditional head a bit, which we need to do much more of because diaspora extends far, far outside of just the global north. So how do you feel your research responds to the many academics who have called for a greater focus and an emphasis on studies discussing South-South dynamics? Because obviously this is a story of quote-unquote South-South migration. Is it a response? If so, how?
Yeah, when I look into the data, actually, it happens so that most of the migration of Africans happen within Africa. For example, 80% of Africans migrate within Africa, and most of them in the regional economic blocks. For example, West Africans travel within West Africa. East Africans travel within East Africa. South Africans also travel or migrate within South African countries because of finance, ease of mobility, and other reasons. But much focus is given to migration to Europe or migration to the US. And I thought it is also a point of departure from the conventional narrative where we pay attention to 20% or 12% of migrants that got much attention by the media as well as by the academia. So I thought it would be a very important research in terms of fairness also, not just while most of the migrants within Africa are migrating, if the academia, the funding, the media focus on southern migration, who is going to study the remaining,
80%.
the huge 80% of migrants within Africa? And I thought that also gave me another energy or another point of departure to focus on migration from East Africa to South Africa. And that's how it's developed or it emerged.
That's wonderful. That makes perfect sense. And I kind of want to go back to talking about your background for a second, if we could. As you're doing this very difficult role of challenging a lot of these perceptions that conversations about migration should happen about the places in the world where it happens almost the least, like Fortress Europe and etc. So going back to talking about yourself a little bit, given your background, I noted that you worked as a consultant a few times as a research consultant for different NGOs. USAID is one of them. And you also, in your book, write in a very accessible manner. You originally wrote it in Amharic, and then it was translated into English, which already vastly widens your audience. So could you just tell us a little bit more about, first, how your background working a bit as a practitioner influenced your work, and also how you feel about writing for very different audiences?
Yeah, working as a practitioner and also reading other literatures, it's not just academic literature, but also other literatures, somehow enriched me with this idea of the disconnect between academia and media, the disconnect between academia and the regular people. So I thought, what is this disconnect coming from? And I found out that most of the academic research are somehow secluded and separated from the media and from the regular people And I found in the Ethiopian context at least that the academic environment is somehow passive in terms of its linkage with the regular readers and the journalists and the mainstream media or the social media. And I thought I would narrow that gap or I would bridge that gap with a book. And one of the barrier for the disconnection between academia and the regular readers is language. And I studied in English language. I wrote my thesis in English language, but that remained in Germany or in some academic journal in the global north. So I thought I would uh, write in the local language. The findings of the research. I studied this Ethiopian migrating to South Africa, and the finding remains in Germany or somewhere else in Europe. So, what is the purpose of education unless you bring some impact on the very population, on the very society that you study, or on the very politicians or other actors that influence policy? So I thought I would write in English. That's one thing. The other disconnect I found, I would write in Amharic, the local language. The other disconnect I found is the way academic uh, articles are also written is also full of concepts and philosophies and hard conceptual underpinning this feeding into the findings of the research. But there could be another way of presenting these findings, and I thought it would be putting human face in it, human stories, human element into the narratives of the migrants. So what I did in the book was pick four chapters. In the first chapter, I introduced the methodologies that I followed while doing the research, while at the same time giving some background about the readers, for the readers about the real situation in South Africa and Johannesburg, and the research sites in Johannesburg and different townships of South Africa. And the other three chapters pick an individual migrant and follow the life story of that migrant while embedding the research findings side by side so that the readers can follow the story at the same time, get something about the migration phenomenon. Uh, the book is about bridging between academia and media, academia and the regular readers, and it is an attempt to make academia an active actor
Hmm. Rather than passive.
rather than passive.
And you've really shown, though, that you can do both. You can write for a public audience. Your book is full of images, poems, anecdotes, all the things people want to read.
Yeah.
But the academic work that you presented here has been and will present is still perfect bread and butter academic work. That you have a lot of theory, but you're still challenging these concepts. So you've shown that you can do both very well. And in your piece, you sort of tackle the notion of the smuggler and the smuggled, what that means within local and also transnational economies and relationships between the global north and global south. So in a time when there have been so many news stories about smugglers and those requiring their services, what does your research, do you feel, add that's new or a new analysis on this topic or a reframing of some kind?
Yeah, I mean, in the previous times or in the past years, the focus on smugglers were more or less criminalizing them, or sometimes even scapegoating them on purpose. And they are scapegoated not only by high-level politicians like the European Union or the South African government or the Ethiopian government, but also by the very immigrants themselves, in order to benefit from in order to gain protection or support from the diaspora population. So smugglers were attacked from both sides, from politicians at macro level and from individual immigrants making stories, making their travel horrible stories and making smugglers look like Satan or devil. I mean, I'm not protecting smugglers in this way, but they do within that context. They do these facilitation roles. So most of the literature were in the past were criminalizing them. or making look like them devil or evil idol them. That's one side of the story. The other side of the story, more recently, is that smugglers provide protection from below. Smugglers facilitate migration. Smugglers are human beings. But my point is, smugglers, in as much as smugglers are gate opener, in as much as smugglers are providers of opportunities, in as much as smugglers are facilitators of migration from one point to another, they could also be criminal, or they could also be dangerous for migrants. They could also be exploitative elements. So this concept of gate opener and grave diggers come together, and it's better to focus on what factors, what environmental, political, cultural, and social factors provide that environment for smugglers to be gate openers or for smugglers to be grave diggers, and what can be done about in order to protect immigrants, not only in destination countries but mainly in transit countries.
Right.
That's being missing from most of the analysis these days. For example, from Ethiopia to South Africa, there are like 6, 7 transit countries, and these people has to pass through these countries. But we are giving much focus on Ethiopia and South Africa,
Right.
the source and the host societies.
Right.
But they are ignored
Critical processes
in rules.
happening.
Yes, a lot of process happens, a lot of change happen, a lot of protection measures are not provided, a lot of corruptions happens, a lot of exploitation and even other kinds of risks take place in between. So yeah, smugglers facilitate the migration, but we have to understand that they are also operating in a capitalist system, and they are mostly driven by profit. And they could do anything to individual migrants, even they can go to the extent of commoditizing people to benefit from the business.
So, kind of off of that, one of the things that you focus a lot on in your book, as well as in your paper, is on the humanizing aspect. That it's so, so important to look at everyone from street children to a person who may have been keen to mug you, to migrants themselves, just as humans, to reinstill that human element that we seem to be so sorely lacking nowadays. Um, one of the interesting elements in your paper I found was the kind of presence of a lot of women, actually. So you talk in one portion about brides who are smuggled from Ethiopia to South Africa, and they have these, wild videos filmed of their weddings, which can then encourage more to come. It can almost be promotional materials back home. And then you also mention, a young man seeking out and marrying a woman with South African connections or a wealthier family in order to facilitate that process. So I think the lives of these women and gender in general plays kind of an interesting but elusive role in your paper. And forgive me if it's an unfair question. Is there anything you kind of would like to flesh out a little bit more about these women, their roles, not necessarily being the direct economic migrants, but still playing very critical cultural and in some ways economic roles?
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to look into the migration of women, which is migration-induced migration actually. It was migration from Ethiopia to South Africa was dominated by male because of the hardship in route and the hardship in settlement as well. The nature of the business they are engaged in, and the reality, the violence and crime reality in the informal economy of South Africa. These factors conspire one another to attract male migrants only in the initial years of the migration. But through time, these male migrants developed their financial position, and they are not allowed to move out and re-enter. So because of their paper or because of the status. So when they are old enough to get married, they want to import or smuggle in a prospective wife from Ethiopia. Mostly those migrants from rural areas of Ethiopia. And this smuggling of wives or prospective wives has a lot to do with imported social institutions from Ethiopia, including the so-called social institutions, including Edders and Mahabar. It's a gathering institution where people contribute for the ceremony, but these contributions are kind of quid pro quo. You are expected to contribute when your friend also get married or smuggles in a wife. So it's a kind of tit for tat that you are expected to pay when your friend get married or smuggles in a wife. There are two ceremonies. This one is welcome ceremony and the other is wedding ceremony. And these both ceremonies are somehow uh, uh, in, superimposed with the business environment in South Africa. So the male migrants who establish themselves and who settled in South Africa make money out of these two ceremonies. And the money could go to as high as $5,000 or even $10,000. That's a profit. Because of this profit, some Ethiopians do not want to get married to the locals. They would rather import or smuggle in a wife from Ethiopia. So this, in a way, commoditizes women.
Right.
But the women also benefit materially and financially, given the inequality between Ethiopia and South Africa. That's one thing. The other thing about migration and women I wanted to look into was about hierarchies of power through migration, hierarchies of power and privilege through migration. And there are a lot of studies in other settings where left behind wives benefited from migration of husbands, or migrated wives benefited from their migration, liberating themselves from patriarchy, liberating themselves from drudgeries of rural life. But I wanted to look into what happens to the Ethiopian woman who migrated from Ethiopia all the way to South Africa. And that's the other aspect I am looking into. And the evidence until now suggests that they are somehow exploited in terms of working long hours and taking the role of wives and workers. And they are also benefiting materially and financially. So it's a matter of making cost benefit analysis. If people say the material financial benefit outweigh the discrimination and exploitation in the informal economy of South Africa, then it is a benefit for them. But the overall picture shows that there is the success of male in the informal economy of South Africa is mainly as a result of exploitation of female workers or wives. And this husband-wife relationship is not temporary or transitory. It continues for some time unless there is a divorce between the two. And whenever there are divorces, it's usually the male that are benefiting or taking advantage of the divorce because they are working in the informal economy with low protection, with it's kind of the survival of the fittest in that. Yeah, yeah.
It's there's so much that you laid out there and so much more that could be 5 other papers. Just how women fit into all of these different hierarchies, how they're both actors, but yet also viewed sometimes as commodity. So there's so much more to say. But everyone will have to read your paper and especially your book, Wayfarer's Travel Journal, came out in 2018. And I guess in closing, I'd just like to ask if there is one thing that people walk away from this conference knowing about your work or knowing from your work. What would that be?
It's difficult to put it in one sentence or in one message, but one of the things that matters today is to stay human, and to respect others, to put yourself in other shoes and do unto others what you would have them do unto you. And it works at different level and it works in different circumstances. So depending on the context you are in, if you, one thing that I realized in my life is that everyone needs respect and everyone deserves respect. So respecting the other person is not for only the other person, but it's also for yourself. It's also a matter of building relationship. You know, we all are somehow connected in a way that we don't understand, we don't see, but we are connected. So we say the world is small. We say the world is narrow. The world is becoming a global village, but it's becoming a global village only for a selected few. We are some kind of, you know, leaving out the mass from the corridors of globalization or from the imaginary world that we are trying to create. But all of all human beings need and deserve respect, and it can be an important area of engagement or interception to build a better future and to build a better connection with us, ourselves, and with others.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you so much. That's a wonderful lesson to walk away from. Keep viewing people as humans, reinstill that humanity, and keep helping other humans. Thank you so much.
Thank you.